What is the first thing you feel when you wake up? The soft warmth of your blankets? The gentle light from a window? For the inhabitants of a medieval castle, the first sensation of the day was often a brutal, biting cold that seeped deep into their bones, a cold that light could not conquer. We imagine castles as grand fortresses of power and comfort, but for the hundreds who lived within their walls, they were often cold, damp, and dark prisons of daily routine. We're going to spend a day and a night inside one to see the reality behind the legend. If you enjoy exploring the forgotten corners of history, consider liking this video and subscribing for more journeys into the past. Let us know in the comments what one thing you think you'd miss most from the modern world. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight in Bedtime History, our journey begins not with a king on a throne, but in the moments before sunrise, as the first reluctant stirrings of life break the silence of the stone fortress. The day begins long before the sun. The world inside the castle walls is a stone womb. It is dark, it is still, and it is profoundly, deeply cold. This is not the crisp, clean cold of a winter morning in the open air. This is a damp, heavy cold that has soaked into the very fabric of the building overnight. The massive stone walls, some many feet thick, have been drinking in the chill of the long night, and now they breathe it back into every chamber, every corridor, every nook and cranny. The air itself feels thick with it, a tangible presence that settles in the lungs. You can see your own breath. A small, fleeting cloud of white mist in the oppressive dark. These fortresses were marvels of military engineering, designed with one primary purpose in mind: defense. Every element, from the height of the walls to the placement of the towers, was calculated for its tactical advantage. Comfort was not a consideration. It was a luxury so far down the list of priorities that it barely registered at all. The very materials that made a castle so formidable against an attacking army also made it a relentless enemy to its own inhabitants. The stone, so strong and enduring, acted as a colossal heat sink, but for the cold. It held the dampness from the rain-soaked earth and the ever-present humidity of the northern European climate, ensuring that a feeling of clammy chill was a constant companion, regardless of the season. In this pre-dawn gloom, your eyes are useless. You are guided by feel, by memory. The world is a tapestry of textures. The blanket covering you is not soft cotton or down. It is wool. Heavy, coarse, and slightly greasy to the touch from the natural lanolin in the fibers. This wool is a small mercy, as it possesses the remarkable quality of retaining some warmth even when it is damp, and everything here is, to some degree, damp. Beneath you is not a supportive mattress, but a palliasse. This is essentially a large sack, woven from rough burlap or canvas and stuffed with whatever was available. Most often, this was straw. The straw is a universe unto itself. It is dry and brittle, and with every small movement, it rustles and crackles, a sound that seems impossibly loud in the profound silence. Over weeks and months of use, it has been compacted into a lumpy, uneven surface, but it is not just straw you are sleeping on. These mattresses were a haven for vermin. Mice, tiny and unseen, scurry through the stalks, their scratching a faint but persistent soundtrack to the night. Fleas and lice thrive in this environment, their bites a familiar, itchy irritation on the skin. A fine, gritty dust from the decomposing straw coats everything. It works its way into your hair, your clothes, and onto your skin, a constant, low-grade annoyance. These palliasses were changed infrequently, perhaps once a year if you were lucky. The old, soiled straw would be removed, and if the season was right, replaced with fresh straw from the harvest. A brief period of relative comfort and cleanliness before the cycle of decay and infestation began anew. The floor beneath your meager bed is not wood. It is stone. Flagstones worn smooth by generations of footsteps. As you swing your legs out from under the wool blanket, the shock of the cold stone on your bare feet is breathtaking. It is a raw, biting cold that seems to zap the warmth right out of your body, a jolt that truly signals the start of another harsh day. There are no carpets, no rugs to soften the blow, just the unyielding, frigid stone. This is the reality for the vast majority of the castle's population. The soldiers, the servants, the grooms, the kitchen hands. They sleep communally. Perhaps here, on the floor of the great hall, where the faint, residual warmth of yesterday's fire has long since vanished. Or they are crowded into windowless attic spaces, the rafters just inches above their heads. They might be in a wooden outbuilding in the bailey, the wind whistling through the gaps in the timber walls. They lie side by side, a mass of humanity huddled together for shared warmth. The air thick with the smell of stale sweat, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The concept of privacy is a foreign one, an unimaginable luxury. You sleep, wake, and live your life in the constant presence of others. Even for the lord and lady of the castle, the experience is only one of degree. They have a private chamber, the solar. This is a significant elevation in status and comfort. Their bed is a grand affair, a heavy wooden frame, often intricately carved, and large enough to be a piece of furniture that dominates the room. Crucially, it is enclosed by thick, heavy curtains. These curtains, often made of rich velvet or embroidered wool, create a small, contained space, a bedchamber within the larger room. This is a vital innovation, designed to trap the occupant's body heat and keep out the worst of the drafts that snake through the chamber. Their mattress might be stuffed with softer wool, or even feathers, a true mark of immense wealth. But still, the cold seeps in. The stone walls of their chamber are just as unforgiving. The air they breathe is just as damp. To combat the chill and the oppressive gloom, the walls might be hung with tapestries. These woven masterpieces are not merely for decoration, although their vibrant scenes of hunts, battles, or biblical stories provide a splash of color in the monochrome world of stone and wood. They serve a vital, practical purpose. They are an extra layer of insulation, a barrier, however thin, between the cold, radiating stone and the living space of the room. They help to block the insidious drafts that find their way through every crack and crevice, creating a slightly more hospitable environment. But even with these additions, the damp remains a constant foe. It encourages the growth of mold and mildew, which stains the beautiful tapestries and leaves a musty, cloying smell in the air. For anyone with a weak chest or a tendency towards respiratory ailments, this perpetual dampness was a chronic and often debilitating health issue. Light is as precious as warmth. In these early hours, it is non-existent. The castle is almost entirely dark. The only sources of light might be the faint glow of dying embers in a hearth, or a single tallow candle sputtering in a holder. The windows in most parts of the castle are not the grand glazed expanses we see in fantasy films. Glass was an extraordinary luxury, a technology so difficult and expensive to produce that its use was reserved for the most important of places. You might find it in the delicate tracery of a chapel window, casting colored light upon the altar, a symbol of divine glory. Or perhaps in a single small pane in the Lord's solar, a conspicuous display of his immense wealth and status. For everyone else, windows were a compromise between light, air, and security. Many were simply arrow slits, tall, narrow voids in the stone, designed to allow an archer to shoot at attackers while presenting the smallest possible target. They let in only a sliver of light and a constant whining draft. Larger window openings would be covered not with glass, but with more humble materials. Sometimes pieces of translucent animal horn, scraped thin or pieced together. More commonly, it was oiled linen or paper, stretched taut across a wooden frame. These materials were translucent rather than transparent. They allowed a dim, murky light to filter through, but offered no view of the outside world and provided almost no insulation against the cold. And in this cold, dark, shared space, the morning brings with it a necessary but unpleasant chore. Overnight, chamber pots were used. These were simple ceramic or wooden vessels, the medieval equivalent of a portable toilet. With the dawn comes the task of emptying them. There was no sophisticated plumbing, no sewage system. The contents were simply carried to the nearest window or a specially designed opening in the wall, known as a guardrobe, and unceremoniously dumped out. They would fall into the central courtyard, the bailey, or, in many cases, directly into the moat that surrounded the castle. This practice contributed to the generally unsanitary conditions and the powerful, ever-present smells that characterized castle life. Even the lord and lady, in their private chamber, relied on this basic system, and the notion of privacy remained elusive. It was not uncommon for high-ranking attendants or trusted servants to sleep on pallets at the foot of the Lord's great bed, a constant human presence for security and immediate service. The solitary awakening is a modern invention. Here, you are never truly alone. As your body shivers, fighting the relentless assault of the cold that seems to emanate from the very stones around you, your mind and the collective mind of the entire castle turns to the first and most urgent necessity of the day: fire, warmth. But creating warmth in a stone fortress was a monumental chore in itself, a task that began in the dark, long before anyone of rank was truly awake. This is where the hierarchy of the castle, its rigid and unyielding social structure, first becomes visible. The heart of the castle, in many ways, was the Great Hall. This cavernous space was the center of communal life, where meals were eaten, judgments were passed, and celebrations were held. And at its center was the main hearth. This was not a fireplace in the modern sense, built neatly into a wall with a chimney to draw the smoke away. In most castles of the high medieval period, it was an open fire pit, a stone-lined depression in the middle of the floor. Directly above it, in the high, vaulted ceiling, would be an opening, a louver, designed to allow the smoke to escape. In theory, in practice, this system was notoriously inefficient. Much of the heat generated by the massive fire went straight up and out of the roof, along with a portion of the smoke. The rest of the smoke, thick and acrid, would simply billow outwards, filling the upper reaches of the hall in a permanent, stinging haze before slowly finding its way out through the louver or other openings. It coated the rafters in a thick, black layer of soot and made the air in the hall perpetually hazy and difficult to breathe. Fireplaces with copper chimneys, built into the stone walls, were a later medieval innovation, a significant technological leap in domestic comfort. And even when they became available, they were reserved for the elite. The lord and lady would have such a fireplace in their solar, and perhaps another in their private bedchamber. The kitchen would have massive hearths for cooking. But for the rest of the castle, the smoky, inefficient central hearth of the great hall was the primary source of warmth. To feed these fires required a constant supply of fuel. Wood was the most common, but in some regions, dried peat was used. This fuel was a valuable and carefully managed resource. It represented an enormous amount of labor. Trees had to be felled, chopped into manageable logs, hauled back to the castle, often over considerable distances, and then stacked to dry. This was a relentless year-round task, essential for survival. A large castle could consume a small forest's worth of wood in a single winter. And so, in the pre-dawn blackness, the day begins for the lowest-ranking servants. A young boy, a scullion from the kitchens perhaps, is given the task of tending to the fires. He moves silently through the sleeping bodies in the great hall, his bare feet calloused against the cold stone. He carries a small pot containing precious embers from the previous night's fire, carefully preserved overnight in ash. If the embers have died, he must start from scratch with a flint and steel, a tedious process of striking sparks onto dry tinder until a tiny flame catches. He gently blows the embers back to life, adding small twigs and kindling until a proper fire is established in the central hearth. He will do the same in the vast kitchen fireplaces, the bakery ovens, and, if he is permitted, in the solar of the lord and lady. His is the first labor of the day, the foundational task upon which all other comforts will be built. His hands are chapped and blackened with soot. The acrid smoke stings his eyes, but he brings the promise of warmth to the waking castle. As the first fires crackle and hiss, sending shadows dancing across the stone walls, the rest of the castle begins to stir. The social hierarchy, as rigid as the stone walls themselves, dictates the order of the day. The scullions and kitchen maids are among the first to rise, their work beginning immediately. Then the men-at-arms, the guards who have been on watch through the coldest hours of the night, are relieved by a fresh shift. Their movements are stiff, their faces grim from the cold. The squires, young boys in service to the castle's knights, begin to tend to their masters' horses and armor. Ladies in waiting, the companions and assistants to the lady of the castle, begin their own quiet preparations. Every single person, from the highest to the lowest, has a defined role, a set of duties that fits into the complex machinery of castle life. This intricate web of responsibilities is overseen by the castle steward or marshal, a man of immense importance who acts as the lord's chief administrator, organizing the daily schedules and ensuring every task is performed. For most of the inhabitants, the day officially began not with work, but with prayer. The castle's chaplain was a key figure, responsible for the spiritual well-being of its population. At the first light, a bell would ring, calling everyone to a brief morning mass in the castle chapel. This was a mandatory observance. It reinforced the shared faith that underpinned medieval society, and also served as a moment to gather and receive orders for the day from the steward. The lord and his family might attend this communal service, or they might have a private mass said in their own smaller oratory. As people make their way from their sleeping quarters to the chapel or their posts, the sounds of the castle awakening begin to fill the air. The silence of the night is replaced by a cacophony of human activity. A chorus of coughing echoes through the cold, damp corridors. Dogs, ever present in medieval households, begin to bark and stir. You hear the clatter of wooden buckets as water is hauled from the central well in the bailey. Orders are shouted, their echoes sharp in the enclosed space. From the armory or the blacksmith's forge, you might hear the rhythmic scrape and ring of a blade being sharpened on a whetstone. The castle is transforming from a sleeping stone giant into a living, breathing, noisy organism. Personal hygiene in this world was a concept far removed from our own. For most, the morning ablutions consisted of a quick wash of the face and hands. A servant would bring a basin of water and a piece of linen for drying. The water was invariably cold, fetched from the well or a cistern. Soap was a luxury, and bathing the entire body was an infrequent event, often seen as a medicinal or ceremonial activity rather than a daily routine. Getting dressed was a process of layering for warmth. The base layer, for both men and women, was a simple undertunic, or chemise, made of linen. Linen, woven from the flax plant, was softer than wool and more comfortable against the skin. Over this, they would add layers of wool. Tunics, leggings, and gowns, all made of this versatile, warm fabric. The colors of these garments were derived from natural dyes made from plants, insects, and minerals. The wealthy could afford vibrant, expensive colors like deep reds and blues, while the common folk wore more muted, earthy tones of brown, green, and yellow. The process of getting dressed, especially for the nobility, could be a ritual in itself. A lord or lady would be assisted by their personal servants, a process that could include the complex lacing of a gown or the buckling of a sword belt. For some of these servants, there was even a recognized perquisite known as the rousing fee, a small payment or privilege granted for the specific task of waking the lord or his important guests and assisting them in starting their day. The first meal of the day, for the majority of the castle's workers, was a simple, practical affair. It was often taken on the move, a piece of bread clutched in one hand as they hurried to their duties. This was not a leisurely seated breakfast in the modern sense. It was fuel. The bread would be dark and heavy, made from rye or a mixture of wheat and rye called maslin. It was dense, chewy, and nourishing. To wash it down, they would drink small beer. This was a low-alcohol brew, a staple of the medieval diet for everyone, including children. It was nutritious, full of carbohydrates from the grain, and crucially, it was often safer to drink than water. With the fires now blazing in the great hearths, and the castle's population stirring from their cold slumber, the focus of all, rich and poor alike, turns to that first essential meal of the day, the breaking of the fast. This meal, more than any other, would reveal the stark divides etched into the very stones of the fortress. For the vast majority, the soldiers, servants, and laborers, breakfast was not a formal occasion. It was something to be consumed quickly, often standing up after morning prayers or as a brief pause from the first chores of the day. The central pillar of this meal, and indeed of the entire medieval diet, was bread. The castle was a machine that ran on bread, and its bakery was one of the most vital facilities within the walls, operating almost constantly to produce the enormous quantities needed to feed hundreds of people. The quality of the bread you ate was a direct reflection of your status. The lord and his family received the finest loaves, known as manchet bread. This was made from pure, finely sifted wheat flour, resulting in a white, light, and soft loaf that was a true symbol of luxury. The senior officials and knights might receive a slightly less refined wheaten bread, but for the servants and laborers, their daily bread was a different thing entirely. It was the dark, dense, and often sour-tasting maslin bread, made from a mix of wheat and rye, or even pure rye or barley bread. It was heavy and filling, designed to provide sustenance for a long day of physical labor. Alongside this bread was the ubiquitous small beer or ale. In a world where sanitation was poorly understood, water sources could be dangerously contaminated. The well within the castle bailey, though a vital source of water for cooking and cleaning, was often located perilously close to the stables or the latrines. Seepage through the soil could easily contaminate the water with dangerous bacteria, making diseases like dysentery a constant threat. The process of brewing, which involved boiling the water, effectively sterilized it. The resulting ale was therefore a much safer and more nutritious alternative. It provided calories and hydration, and its low alcohol content meant it could be consumed throughout the day without causing significant intoxication. The Lord and his immediate family, however, would break their fast with a more substantial meal, taken in the relative warmth and privacy of their solar. They too would eat the fine manchet bread, but theirs would be accompanied by wine, another marker of high status, often imported at great expense from France. They might also have leftover meat from the previous night's supper, perhaps a slice of roasted fowl or a piece of preserved pork served cold. While still simple by our standards, this combination of white bread, wine, and meat represented a level of dietary privilege unimaginable to the servant chewing on his hunk of dark bread in the bustling hall below. The very concept of our modern 3 meals a day was not yet established in this period. Most people in the medieval world consumed 2 main meals: dinner, which was the largest meal of the day, eaten around midday, and supper, a lighter meal taken in the early evening before sunset. Breakfast, for those who had it, was merely a prelude, a quick refueling before the real work began. The way food was consumed also highlighted the social order. In the Great Hall, common folk might eat from simple wooden bowls, using spoons carved from wood or animal horn. A crucial piece of tableware was the trencher. This was not a plate as we know it, but a thick slab of stale, hard bread, a day or 2 old. Food, often a thick stew or pottage, would be spooned directly onto the trencher. The bread would soak up the juices and gravies and could be eaten at the end of the meal. For the very poor, or for the castle's dogs, these gravy-soaked trenchers were a welcome handout. Forks were not used for eating. They were a rare novelty, sometimes used in the kitchen for handling large pieces of meat. People ate with spoons, a personal knife that they carried with them, and most commonly, their fingers. Etiquette manuals of the time focused on rules for eating politely with one's hands, such as using only the first few fingers of the right hand and not putting all of them into the communal dish. Nothing was ever wasted. Leftover food was a critical resource. Scraps from the high table would be collected and repurposed. They might be incorporated into the pottages and stews that formed the basis of the servants' meals, or distributed as alms to the poor who gathered at the castle gates. Even dairy products like cheese and butter, while readily available from the castle's own farms, had a complex social meaning. In some contexts, they were considered humble peasant food, while in others, a fine-aged cheese could be a delicacy fit for the Lord's table. Ultimately, this first meal was not about pleasure or culinary artistry. It was about function. It was about providing the necessary fuel to power the human engine of the castle for another day of relentless labor. Fueled by this simple, starchy fare, the castle population now scatters to their posts. The brief communal moments of prayer and breakfast are over. The day's real work begins, and the castle transforms into a hive of purposeful activity. For the vast majority of its inhabitants, the hours between sunrise and sunset will be defined by relentless, physically demanding labor, a series of essential tasks that keep the fortress alive and functioning. The castle was far more than just a military stronghold or a noble residence. It was a complex, self-contained economic engine, a bustling town compressed within stone walls, where every person played a vital and often grueling role. The air begins to fill with the sounds of industry. From the direction of the forge, you hear the rhythmic, metallic clang of a blacksmith's hammer striking hot iron on an anvil. The blacksmith was one of the most crucial artisans in the castle community. He repaired armor and weapons, shoed the lord's valuable war horses, and fabricated everything from nails and hinges to iron cooking pots. His forge, with its roaring fire and glowing metal, was a place of intense heat and constant noise. Nearby, other craftsmen would be at their work. A fletcher meticulously fletched arrows, carefully gluing feathers to the shaft to ensure a true flight. An armorer might be painstakingly riveting plates onto a piece of armor, while a carpenter sawed timber for repairs to the castle's wooden structures or built new furniture. Women's work was equally vital, though often less visible. In dedicated workshops or simply in corners of the Great Hall, women would be engaged in the endless tasks of textile production. They would spend countless hours at the spinning wheel or with a drop spindle, turning raw wool or flax into thread. This thread would then be taken to the great loom, where weavers would interlace it to create the cloth needed for everyone's clothing, bedding, and sacks. Other women would be mending torn garments, brewing the vast quantities of ale consumed each day, tending the castle's vegetable and herb gardens, or working in the frantic heat of the kitchens. The stables were another center of constant activity. Horses were the medieval equivalent of both the sports car and the army tank. They were essential for transport, communication, hunting, and most importantly, for warfare. They represented a massive investment and were treated with great care. Grooms and stable hands worked from dawn till dusk, mucking out the stalls, a back-breaking task that filled the air with the strong, pungent smell of manure and hay. They were responsible for feeding, watering, and grooming the animals, ensuring the lord's destriers, or war horses, were always in peak condition. High above, on the stone battlements, the castle guard followed their strict rotation of duties. Sentries stood watch on the towers, their eyes scanning the surrounding countryside for any sign of threat. Guards manned the gatehouse, the castle's most vulnerable point, ready to raise the alarm and lower the heavy iron portcullis. Others patrolled the bailey and the outer walls, their footsteps a steady, reassuring presence. Theirs was a life of routine and vigilance, punctuated by moments of intense boredom and the ever-present possibility of sudden danger. The administration of this entire operation often fell to the lady of the castle. While the lord was concerned with warfare, politics, and justice, his wife was typically the chief executive of the household. She managed the vast staff, oversaw the procurement and storage of all supplies, from food to firewood, and was responsible for the budget. Especially when the lord was away at war or at court, which was often, the lady was the de facto ruler of the castle, a position of immense responsibility. Her day would be filled with meetings with the steward, the cook, and other heads of department. Children in the castle began their life's work almost as soon as they could walk. Their path was determined entirely by their birth. The sons of nobility would begin their training as pages around the age of 7. They would serve the lord and lady, learning courtly manners, before graduating to become squires in their teens. As squires, they would serve a knight directly, learning the arts of war, swordsmanship, horsemanship, and strategy. The daughters of the nobility would learn from their mother how to manage a great household, mastering the skills of needlework, music, and the complex etiquette they would need as the future wife of another lord. For the children of servants, life was very different. They began working as soon as they were physically able, performing simple tasks like fetching water, turning a spit in the kitchen, or weeding the garden. They learned their parents' trades on the job, their childhood a brief apprenticeship for a life of labor. Overseeing the spiritual and educational life of the castle was the chaplain or priest. He not only led the daily religious services, but often served as a scribe, since literacy was a rare skill. He might write the Lord's letters, keep the household accounts, and tutor the noble children. Justice was also a part of the daily routine. The Lord, or his steward in his absence, would hold court in the great hall, settling disputes among the inhabitants, punishing minor crimes like theft or fighting, and maintaining order within the community. The day was not structured by the mechanical ticking of a clock. Clocks were rare and unreliable curiosities. Instead, life was governed by the natural rhythm of the sun and by the ringing of the chapel bell. The bell would toll to mark the canonical hours, the set times for prayer established by the church: prime at sunrise, terce mid-morning, sext at noon, and so on. These bells provided the framework for the day, signaling to everyone when to work, when to pray, and when to eat. The entire castle operated as a single interconnected organism, its many parts working in a noisy, purposeful, and often grueling rhythm, driven by the needs of survival and the rigid structure of the feudal world. The morning's chill has been driven back, not by the sun, but by the fires of human industry. The castle is now a fully functioning organism, its rhythms dictated by ancient necessities. And at the very center of this midday bustle is the kitchen. It is the furnace at the heart of the castle, a place of heat, noise, and frantic activity, all dedicated to preparing the main meal of the day. This meal, called dinner, was not an evening affair. It was served around 10 in the morning, or perhaps as late as noon, a substantial repast to fuel the remainder of the day's labor. As we step into the kitchen, we leave behind the world of noble chivalry and enter a realm of smoke, sweat, and sustenance. The air is thick. It is a palpable cocktail of smells and sensations. The overwhelming heat from multiple open fires and massive cauldrons hits you first. It's a damp, oppressive heat, thick with smoke that stings the eyes and coats the back of the throat. The kitchens were often located in a separate building or in the basement of a tower to minimize the risk of a catastrophic fire spreading to the rest of the castle. The noise is a constant, chaotic symphony. The clang of iron pots, the sharp chop of cleavers on massive wooden blocks, the sizzle of fat hitting flame, and the shouted orders of the head cook, a figure of absolute authority in this domain. The floors are slick and treacherous, coated in a layer of grease, spilled water, and discarded vegetable scraps. This is not a place of culinary delicacy. It is a factory for food. For the vast majority of the castle's inhabitants, the centerpiece of their dinner is pottage. In a gigantic iron cauldron, suspended over a roaring fire, bubbles a thick, grayish-brown stew. This is the cornerstone of the medieval diet. Its base is grain, usually hardy oats or barley, which gives it a thick, porridge-like consistency. To this is added whatever vegetables are in season, pulled from the castle's gardens or the surrounding fields. Onions, leeks, cabbages, and peas are common. The pottage is a meal of perpetual creation. New ingredients are simply added to the pot as old ones are ladled out. It might simmer for days on end. If they are lucky, a few scraps of meat or a chunk of bacon might be thrown in to add flavor and a little richness. But for most, this humble, monotonous, yet filling stew is their daily reality. It is served in wooden bowls, eaten with spoons, its blandness a familiar taste of life at the bottom of the hierarchy. But for the lord, the lady, and their honored guests at the high table in the great hall, a very different meal is being prepared. Here the air carries a different scent. It is the rich, mouth-watering aroma of roasting meat. Dominating one of the largest hearths is a long iron spit, and on it a whole pig turns slowly, its skin crackling and turning a deep, golden brown. Roasting meat over an open fire was a cooking method reserved almost exclusively for the nobility. It was inefficient, required a great deal of expensive fuel, and demanded constant attention. It was cooking as theater, a display of wealth and power. The task of turning that heavy spit for hours on end was grueling. In some great houses, this job was performed by a creature bred for the purpose, the turnspit dog. This was a long-bodied, short-legged dog, forced to run for hours inside a small wooden wheel mounted on the wall, which was connected to the spit by a chain and pulley system. It was a miserable existence for these animals. More commonly, the task fell to the lowest of the low in the kitchen hierarchy. A young kitchen boy, known as a spitjack, would have the unenviable job of sitting by the intense heat of the fire, slowly and steadily turning the crank that rotated the meat, ensuring it cooked evenly while being basted in its own fats. His face would be flushed with heat, his arms aching, his world reduced to the slow, steady rotation of the feast he would never be allowed to taste. And it is not just the method of cooking that separates the two tables, but the flavor itself. As the cook prepares sauces for the Lord's roast, he reaches for a small, locked chest. Inside are the true jewels of the medieval kitchen: spices, black pepper, cloves, nutmeg, mace, ginger, and cinnamon. Today, these are common staples. In the medieval world, they were fantastically expensive, worth more than their weight in gold. They were grown in the far-off lands of Asia and India, and their journey to a European castle involved long, treacherous trade routes across land and sea, passing through countless middlemen who each took their cut. To use these spices lavishly was the ultimate expression of wealth and status. It was a way of telling your guests, without saying a word, that you were powerful enough to command the treasures of the exotic East. These spices served another purpose too. In an age without refrigeration, keeping meat fresh was a constant challenge. Animals were often butchered on site, and the meat had to be consumed quickly or preserved. If a piece of meat was slightly past its prime, its off taste, the first hint of decay, could be effectively masked by a generous application of powerful spices. The rich, therefore, could afford to disguise the taste of spoilage, while the poor simply had to endure it. The most important substance in the kitchen, however, was not a rare spice, but common salt. Salt was the great preservative. It was used in enormous quantities to cure meat and fish, drawing out the moisture and making them inhospitable to the bacteria that cause decay. Hams, bacon, and barrels of salted herring were staples that allowed the castle to survive the long winter months when fresh food was scarce. The taste of this heavily salted food was a constant in the medieval diet, a salient reminder of the precarious balance between feast and famine. To complement the rich meats, sauces were essential. They were often sharp and pungent, designed to cut through the fat and enliven the palate. A common base was verjuice, the sour juice pressed from unripe grapes or crab apples, providing a vinegar-like acidity. This would be combined with other ingredients, like mustard, which grew wild and was a common man's spice, to create bold, aggressive flavors that are quite foreign to our modern tastes. For truly grand feasts, the head cook would display his ultimate skill in the form of subtleties. These were astounding, elaborate sculptures, edible centerpieces designed to amaze and delight the guests between courses. They could be fantastical beasts, miniature castles complete with pennants, or religious and allegorical scenes, all painstakingly crafted from a sugar paste known as marzipan or a simple cooked sugar mixture. These subtleties were not primarily for eating. They were pure spectacle, a demonstration of the Lord's boundless wealth and the artistry he could command. He could afford not only to import sugar, an incredible luxury itself, but to use it for something as frivolous as a temporary sculpture. Honey, harvested from the castle's own hives, was the far more common sweetener used in daily cooking for those who could afford even that small luxury. While the roast turns and the subtleties are crafted, the castle's bread is being made in a separate building, the bakehouse. This was a sensible precaution, as the massive wood-fired ovens posed a significant fire risk. Here, bakers produced the different grades of bread for the castle, but the ovens were also used for cooking other dishes. Baked meats, which we would recognize as pies, were a staple. A thick, coarse pastry case, known as a coffin, was not always meant to be eaten. It often served simply as a cooking vessel for the rich filling of meat or fish inside. The heat of the ovens, the yeasty smell of proving dough, and the skill of the bakers were all essential components of the castle's vast food production system. This entire frantic world of food preparation was a microcosm of the castle itself, a place of intense labor, stark hierarchy, and sensory overload, all driving toward the central, communal ritual of the midday meal. As the kitchens toil relentlessly to produce the day's meals, turning raw ingredients into pottage and roasts, the castle as a whole produces something else in equally vast and far less pleasant quantities. Waste. Every person, every meal, every activity generates refuse, and dealing with that waste was a constant, unpleasant, and absolutely vital challenge. The medieval approach to sanitation reveals a worldview starkly different from our own, one where privacy was rare, and the line between the clean and the unclean was porous and ill-defined. The most sophisticated piece of sanitary technology in the castle was the garderobe. The name derived from the French for wardrobe, or to guard a robe, hints at its function and location. It was, quite simply, the castle toilet. Typically, it was a small room or a closet-like space built into the thickness of the outer wall. Inside, a wooden or stone seat was positioned over a hole. This hole opened into a chute that ran straight down the exterior face of the castle wall. There was no plumbing, no water to flush waste away. Gravity did all the work. The waste simply fell, exposed to the open air, until it landed in a heap in the moat below, on the banks of a nearby river, or into a specially constructed cesspit at the base of the wall. These garderobes were cold, drafty places, with the wind whistling up the chute, a constant reminder of the long drop below. They were often built in clusters, jutting out from the castle wall, their purpose unmistakable to anyone looking up from the outside. The origin of the name garderobe is a fascinating insight into medieval life. It is believed to have come from the practice of hanging expensive woolen robes and other garments inside the toilet shaft. The strong, pungent ammonia fumes rising from the decomposing urine below were thought to be a powerful deterrent to fleas, lice, and moths. So the same space that served for the most basic of human functions also doubled as a primitive pest control closet, a place to guard your robes. It was a brutally practical solution to two separate problems. These garderobes, however, were a privilege of the castle's upper echelons. The lord and lady would have private ones adjoining their solar, and others would be available for the knights and high-ranking officials. For the vast majority of the castle's staff and soldiers, the arrangements were far more crude. They might use a simple wooden hut built over a pit in a corner of the bailey, a privy that would be used until it was full, and then a new pit would be dug. For many, it was even simpler than that. A designated corner of the courtyard, or a simple plank balanced over a ditch, would have to suffice. The concept of public sanitation was centuries away. Inevitably, the cesspits at the base of the garderobe chutes would fill up. Emptying them was a job so foul, so dangerous, and so thoroughly unpleasant that it could only be done at night. The men who performed this task were known as gong farmers or nightmen. Gong was an Old English word for dung or privy. These men were essential public health workers, yet they were social outcasts, their trade marking them as untouchable. Working by the faint light of a lantern, they would climb down into the reeking pits and shovel the accumulated human waste into carts, to be hauled away and disposed of in fields outside the town or dumped into a river. It was perilous work. The fumes inside a cesspit could be toxic and overpowering, and many gong farmers suffocated from the noxious gases. Theirs was perhaps the most wretched job in the entire medieval world. This casual approach to waste was not limited to human effluent. It extended into the very heart of the castle's living spaces. The floors of the Great Hall, the barracks, and even some private chambers were not bare stone. They were covered with a thick layer of organic material, most commonly straw or rushes harvested from nearby marshes. In theory, this provided a soft, insulating layer underfoot. In practice, it became a repository for filth. Spilled ale, grease from meals, discarded bones, and all manner of refuse would be dropped onto the floor and simply become trodden into the rushes. When the top layer became too foul, the solution was not to remove the old rushes, but simply to pile a fresh layer on top. Over months and years, these floor coverings would become a compressed, layered mat of decomposing organic matter. A famous account by the scholar Erasmus in the 16th century describes English floors where the bottom layer could be 20 years old, containing a putrid collection of spittle vomit, the urine of dogs and men spilled beer scraps of fish and other unmentionable filth. To combat the truly horrific smell, aromatic herbs were scattered amongst the new rushes. Sweet-smelling meadowsweet, lavender, and chamomile would be strewn about, their pleasant fragrance a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to mask the underlying stench of decay. The feeling underfoot would have been spongy, damp, and uneven. Adding to this environment was the constant presence of animals. The bailey, the central courtyard of the castle, was a working space, often muddy and filled with chickens scratching in the dirt. But animals were not confined to the outdoors. Dogs, used for hunting and companionship, were a ubiquitous presence, wandering freely through the Great Hall. sleeping by the fire and begging for scraps from the tables. Their waste simply added to the general mess on the floor. This intimate proximity between human living spaces, human waste, and animal waste created a perfect storm. The well that supplied the castle's drinking water was often located in the bailey, just yards away from where animals relieved themselves, and sometimes perilously close to the seepage from a latrine pit or the great midden heap where kitchen waste was tossed. The people of the time did not understand germ theory. They had no concept of bacteria or waterborne pathogens. They did, however, believe that disease was caused by miasma or bad air. They could smell the foul stenches that permeated the castle, and they correctly associated these bad smells with sickness. Their conclusion was simply that the smell itself was the cause of the disease, not the invisible microbes that thrived in the filth that produced the smell. This fundamental misunderstanding meant that their environment was, in essence, a breeding ground for the pests and vermin that were a constant, unwelcome presence in their lives. This environment of poor sanitation, abundant food scraps, and a startling acceptance of filth was a paradise for creatures other than humans. The medieval castle was shared, not just with pets and livestock, but with a teeming population of uninvited guests. Vermin of all shapes and sizes thrived in the dark corners, the straw-stuffed mattresses, and the refuse-laden floors. The battle against these pests was a constant, irritating, and largely losing one, a daily reality for lord and peasant alike. The most visible and audacious of these guests were rats and mice. They were everywhere. The black rat, an agile climber, infested the upper reaches of the castle, scurrying behind the expensive tapestries, nesting in the thatched roofs of outbuildings, and traveling through the wall cavities. The common mouse found its home at ground level, raiding pantries and scurrying across the floor of the great hall. They were attracted by the promise of food. The castle granary, where the precious supply of wheat and barley for bread and ale was stored, was a primary target. Protecting these stores from the relentless assault of rodents was a matter of survival, a major concern for the castle steward. The musty, acrid smell of rodent droppings was a common feature of any food storage area. At night, in the quiet of a bedchamber, the silence would be broken by the faint, scratching sounds of rats scurrying within the very walls around you. To combat this menace, the castle employed its own small, furry army. Cats were not typically cuddly pets. They were working animals, highly prized for their prowess as mousers. A good castle cat was a valuable asset, earning its keep by protecting the food supplies. Ferrets, with their long, slender bodies, were also used to hunt rats, sent down burrows to flush out the rodents. A glimpse of a sleek cat stalking its prey in the shadowy corners of the hall would have been a common and welcome sight. While rats were a visible nuisance, a far more intimate and irritating pest was a constant companion on the bodies of the castle as inhabitants: fleas and lice. These tiny parasitic insects were endemic. They infested the straw palliasses where people slept, the woolen clothes they wore, and their own hair and bodies. The constant, maddening itch of a flea bite was a sensation known to all, regardless of social class. The wealthy were just as likely to suffer as the poor. In a bizarre and telling fashion trend, noble ladies sometimes wore flea furs. These were small pelts of animals, like stoat or marten, worn draped over the shoulders or held in the hand. The idea was that the fleas, attracted to the warmth and scent of the fur, would choose to inhabit the pelt rather than the lady's own body. It was an admission of defeat, an attempt to manage rather than eliminate the problem. Personal grooming tools reflected this daily battle. Fine-toothed combs, meticulously carved from bone, wood, or ivory for the wealthy, were a personal accessory for everyone. They were designed not just for arranging hair, but for the specific, grim purpose of combing out lice and their tiny eggs or nits. The act of nitpicking was a common social activity, a necessary part of personal hygiene. Yet for all this trouble, they had no idea of the true danger these pests represented. They did not know that the fleas living on the black rats that infested their homes were the primary vectors for the bacterium Yersinia pestis. They did not understand that these tiny, itching bites were the delivery mechanism for the Black Death, the most devastating pandemic in human history. Other insects abounded. The lack of glass or screens on most windows meant that the castle was open to the air and everything in it. In the summer months, flies swarmed in the hot, sweet-smelling kitchens and buzzed around the latrines and any exposed waste. They would move from the filth of the cesspit to the food laid out on the high table, their feet carrying a microscopic cargo of disease. Bedbugs were another torment, hiding in the joints of wooden bed frames and emerging at night to feed on sleeping humans. Spiders, of course, were a constant presence, their webs gathering dust in the corners of every room. Attempts to repel these swarms of insects were largely based on herbal remedies. Bunches of strong-smelling plants like wormwood and rue would be hung in doorways and windows, their pungent scent intended to drive the pests away. These methods had limited success. The reality was that life in a castle meant constantly sharing your space, your food, and your body with a host of small, irritating, and often dangerous creatures. Living in such close, unsanitary quarters, surrounded by filth and infested with vermin, it was utterly inevitable that the inhabitants of the castle would be vulnerable to another constant and terrifying threat: sickness and disease. When illness struck, medieval people faced it with a combination of practical herbalism, deep religious faith, and a medical understanding that was fundamentally flawed and often dangerous. The entire framework of medieval medicine was built upon the ancient Greek theory of the four humors. This theory held that the human body was composed of four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy person was one in whom these four humors were perfectly balanced. Sickness, therefore, was believed to be the result of an imbalance, a surplus, or deficiency of one of these fluids. Every ailment, from a common cold to a deadly fever, was diagnosed within this framework. The goal of any treatment was to restore the body's natural equilibrium. The most common method for achieving this was bloodletting. It was the go-to treatment for an astonishing range of conditions. If a patient was feverish or flushed, it was assumed they had a surplus of blood, and the logical solution was to remove some. This procedure was typically performed not by a physician, but by a barber surgeon. These men, who cut hair and shaved beards, also had the sharp tools and steady hands required for minor surgery and bloodletting. The coppery smell of blood would have been a common one in any sickroom. The barber surgeon would either make an incision in a vein with a lancet or use leeches to draw out the excess blood. This practice, while seeming barbaric to us, was the height of medical science at the time. In reality, it often weakened an already sick patient, hastening their decline. Alongside this humoral theory was a rich tradition of practical herbalism. The lady of the castle was often the keeper of this knowledge. Her walled garden contained not just vegetables, but a host of medicinal herbs. She, or a local wise woman, would know which plants to use to treat common ailments. Poppy could be used to dull pain, comfrey to help set bones, and willow bark, which contains a chemical similar to aspirin, to reduce fever. This was practical, experience-based medicine, with knowledge passed down through generations of women. A bitter-tasting herbal tonic, brewed over the hearth, was a far more common medicine than anything a physician might prescribe. Despite these efforts, many diseases were rampant and deadly. Dysentery, known grimly as the bloody flux, was a frequent visitor to the castle, sweeping through the population via contaminated food and water. In an age before antibiotics, even a minor cut or wound could become a major killer. If a wound became infected, showing signs of redness, swelling, and pus, there was very little that could be done. It would often lead to sepsis, a fatal systemic infection. Major surgery was almost unheard of. It was performed without anesthetic, save for a swig of alcohol or a piece of wood to bite on, and without any understanding of sterile procedure. Amputation of a badly infected limb was a desperate last resort, an agonizing ordeal with an appallingly low survival rate. Childbirth was one of the most perilous moments in a woman's life. It was an exclusively female affair, with the lady of the castle and other experienced women attending the birth. But without modern medical knowledge, complications that are now routine could be a death sentence for both mother and child. Dental health was equally dire. Toothache was a common misery, and the only remedy was extraction. This was performed without any form of pain relief by the local barber surgeon or even the blacksmith, using robust pliers to wrench the offending tooth from the jaw. Overlaying all of this was a profound layer of religious belief. Sickness was often interpreted as a divine punishment for sin, or a test of one's faith. Prayer and pilgrimage to the shrine of a saint were considered powerful forms of medicine. The priest's prayers were seen as being just as important as the lady's herbal remedies. Great fear was reserved for diseases like leprosy, which was seen as a mark of profound spiritual corruption, leading sufferers to be cast out from society entirely. The castle might have a rudimentary infirmary, but more often than not, the sick were simply cared for in their own beds in crowded, stuffy rooms, where the windows were kept shut tight to keep out the miasma, or bad air ironically ensuring the room was a perfect breeding ground for germs. Even the wealthy were not immune. Gout, a cripplingly painful joint disease, was known as the disease of kings because it was common among the rich, a direct result of their diet, heavy in red meat, organ meats, and wine. It was a painful, chronic reminder that in the medieval world, no amount of wealth or status could offer true protection from the ever-present realities of pain, sickness, and death. The medieval world was a harsh one, governed by cycles of labor and health we can barely imagine. As we pause our journey, consider which of these daily hardships you would find most difficult to endure. Let us know your thoughts as we prepare to face the falling night. The grind of daily life, with its endless labor and its constant struggle against filth and sickness, defined the rhythm of the castle. But the human spirit is not built for drudgery alone. Within the cold stone walls, life was not merely endured. It was also lived, with moments of vibrant joy, spectacle, and communal celebration. This social fortress, with its rigid hierarchies, was also a home, a stage for the full drama of human experience, from exhilarating pastimes and grand pageantry to the grim realities of justice and the ever-present threat of violence. Life for the inhabitants of the castle found its most spectacular expression in times of leisure. After long periods of work, or to mark a significant occasion, the community would come together for entertainment. The most magnificent of these events was the tournament. This was far more than just a game. It was a potent combination of high-stakes military training, political theater, and public spectacle. In a wide, flat field outside the castle walls, known as the lists, pavilions would be erected, draped in the bright colors of the participating knights. The roar of the crowd, a mix of nobles, merchants, and peasants from the surrounding lands, would create a festival atmosphere. The main event was the joust. Two knights, encased in shining plate armor and mounted on powerful war horses, would charge at each other from opposite ends of the field, their goal to shatter their lance against their opponent's shield. The thundering of hooves, the splintering crack of wood on steel, and the sight of a knight being unhorsed was the pinnacle of martial sport. But the tournament also featured the melee, a chaotic and dangerous mock cavalry battle where two teams of knights would clash in a wild, swirling fight. Though fought with blunted weapons, the melee was brutal, and serious injuries, even deaths, were not uncommon. It was a spectacular, violent, and glorious celebration of the chivalric ideal. When not engaged in mock warfare, the nobility's favorite pastime was the hunt. This too was a blend of sport and practicality, providing both thrilling entertainment and fresh meat for the lord's table. There were two main forms. The first was hunting with hounds, a noisy and exhilarating chase after deer or wild boar, with men on horseback following the baying pack through the forest. The second, more refined, was falconry. This was the art of hunting with trained birds of prey. The lord or lady, a heavy leather gauntlet on their hand, would hold a prized hawk or falcon, its head covered by a small leather hood. At the right moment, the hood would be removed, and the bird would be cast off, soaring into the sky to hunt its prey with breathtaking speed and precision. It was a sport that required immense patience, skill, and a deep understanding between the falconer and the bird. The quiet intensity of the hunt, the smell of horse and leather, and the wild beauty of the landscape offered a profound escape from the confines of the castle walls. Indoors, especially during the long winter evenings, the upper classes sought more cerebral diversions. In the great hall, lit by the roaring central hearth and flickering torchlight, you would find nobles hunched over game boards. Chess, a game of strategy inherited from the Arab world, was immensely popular. Another favorite was a game called tables, a precursor to modern backgammon, played with dice and counters on a distinctive board. The quiet contemplation of a chess match would be punctuated by the sharp clatter of dice being thrown onto a wooden table, often accompanied by wagers. While the church sternly disapproved of gambling, the thrill of a game of chance was a persistent temptation, especially among the soldiers and squires who had little coin to spare but were always willing to risk it. The long evenings were also filled with sound and story. The castle was a lonely outpost, and the arrival of a traveling entertainer was a major event. Minstrels and troubadours, with their lutes and viols, would journey from one great house to another, carrying with them the news and the popular culture of the day. In the great hall, after supper, a minstrel would sing epic ballads of heroic knights like Roland or King Arthur, or romantic lays of courtly love. Their songs and stories were a vital source of entertainment in a society that was largely illiterate. They were the living libraries and newspapers of their time. A lord might also employ a professional fool or jester, a man licensed to speak truth to power through comedy, his sharp wit and acrobatic antics providing a different kind of laughter. For the common soldiers and servants, entertainment was simpler and more physical, but no less important. In the bailey, during breaks from their duties, men would test their strength and skill. Wrestling matches would draw an eager circle of spectators. Archery contests were a constant feature, as skill with the longbow was a vital military requirement, especially in England, where laws mandated practice for all able-bodied men. They would also play games of skill and strategy. You might find 2 guards scratching a board for 9 men's Morris onto a stone bench, using pebbles as their pieces, their minds deeply engaged in the simple ancient game. When the day's work was done, the entire castle community might come together for dancing. A musician with a simple pipe and tabor, a small drum, would strike up a lively tune, and the floor of the great hall would be cleared. Men and women of all classes would join in energetic circle or line dances, a rare opportunity for sanctioned physical contact and communal joy. Storytelling was another cherished pastime. Around the fire, an old soldier would recount tales of battles fought long ago, or a woman would tell folk tales of mischievous fairies and fearsome beasts, her words painting vivid pictures in the minds of her listeners. During major holidays like Christmas, this might become more formal. A mummery would be performed, a type of folk play where costumed actors, their faces hidden, would perform a simple, often comical drama. Even the children found ways to play. Their games were often a direct imitation of the adult world around them. Girls would play with dolls made of cloth or wood, acting out the domestic dramas of the castle. Boys played with carved wooden toy knights, staging their own miniature jousts and battles. They would have small wooden swords and mock weapons, their play a form of apprenticeship for the adult roles they were expected to assume. And in the quiet of the solar, the lady of the castle and her attendants would pass the long hours engaged in embroidery and tapestry work. This was far from idle hobby. With needle and brightly colored thread, they would create vast, intricate narrative scenes, depicting biblical stories, heroic legends, or the great deeds of their own family. This work required immense skill and artistry, and the feeling of the fine thread passing through the linen was a calming, meditative counterpoint to the boisterous life of the rest of the castle. These beautiful creations, which took years to complete, were a testament to the quiet, creative, and often overlooked world of the castle's women. But these moments of levity, of games and celebration, all existed within a strict and unyielding framework of rules and authority. The same great hall that echoed with the sound of a minstrel's lute could, in an instant, be transformed into a court of law. When entertainment turned to argument, when a game of dice led to a brawl, or when the Lord's rules were broken, the castle's system of justice was swift, public, and often brutal. The ultimate authority within the castle walls was the Lord himself. In his domain, he was the law. He served as judge, jury, and often the final court of appeal for any offense committed on his lands. The venue for this justice was most often the great hall. The trestle tables would be cleared away, and the Lord would take his place on his high seat, often on a raised dais, looking down upon the gathered inhabitants. The hall, designed for feasting, would become a courtroom, its high ceilings creating solemn, echoing acoustics that amplified the gravity of the proceedings. Here, the Lord would hear grievances, listen to accusations, and pass judgment. The crimes brought before him were typically those that disrupted the good order of his household. Theft was a common offense, as was poaching on his lands, assault, and public drunkenness that led to brawling. The punishments were designed not for rehabilitation, but as a raw and physical deterrent. They were almost always public. For minor offenses, the stocks and the pillory were favored tools. A guilty party would be locked by their ankles or their head and hands into the heavy wooden frame, set up in the middle of the bailey for all to see. They would be subjected to hours of public ridicule and abuse. People would jeer, spit, and pelt them with whatever was at hand: mud, animal dung, or rotten vegetables. It was a punishment of profound humiliation, a physical manifestation of being cast out from the community's good graces. For more serious offenses, the punishments became more severe. Flogging was a standard sentence for a servant guilty of theft or a soldier guilty of insubordination. The sharp, sickening crack of a whip across a bare back was a sound intended to instill fear and obedience in all who heard it. Fines were also a common punishment, particularly for those who had the means to pay, as they served the dual purpose of punishing the offender and enriching the Lord's coffers. For the gravest of crimes, such as murder, rape, or treason against the Lord, the penalty was death. The execution would also be a public spectacle, designed to send the most powerful message possible. The condemned would often be hanged from a gibbet, a purpose-built gallows erected on a hill or at a crossroads, where the body would be left to rot as a grim and lasting warning to all who passed by. A castle dungeon, a place that looms large in our popular imagination, was not typically used for long-term imprisonment, as it is today. To feed and guard a prisoner for years was an expensive and inefficient use of resources. Instead, the dungeon served primarily as a holding cell. It was a place to lock up an accused person before they faced the Lord's judgment, or to secure a high-value enemy knight captured in battle, who would be held for a hefty ransom. The experience of being in one was terrifying. A dungeon cell was often a small, windowless chamber deep in the foundations of the castle. It was cold, perpetually damp, and utterly dark. The prisoner would be left in isolation, with the smell of wet stone and their own fear, the silence broken only by the drip of water or the scuttling of rats. The feeling of the rough rope on the wrists, the chilling touch of iron shackles, and the profound, hopeless dark made the dungeon a place of psychological as well as physical torment. In earlier medieval periods, guilt or innocence might be determined by a trial by ordeal. An accused person might be forced to carry a red-hot bar of iron for a set distance, or pluck a stone from a cauldron of boiling water. If their hand healed cleanly, it was seen as a sign from God that they were innocent. By the later medieval period, these practices were dying out, being slowly replaced by a system that relied, at least in theory, on witness testimony and evidence. One crime that was treated with exceptional severity was poaching. The deer, boar, and fowl in the Lord's forests were considered his personal property, a symbol of his status and a source for his table. For a peasant to hunt, this game was seen as a direct theft from the Lord himself. The punishments were deliberately cruel and could include branding, flogging, or even mutilation, such as the chopping off of a hand, to ensure the poacher could never again draw a bow. This system of justice was, of course, far from perfect. The Lord's judgment was not always just. It could be swayed by personal favoritism, a well-placed bribe, or a simple, vindictive whim. In a world where personal honor was paramount, a perceived insult could lead to a lasting blood feud, a violent vendetta between families that could simmer for generations, constantly threatening the delicate social order that the Lord's law was meant to protect. Within this rigid, male-dominated legal structure, where the Lord's word was final and punishment was a public spectacle, The women of the castle had to navigate a complex and often precarious existence. Their lives, though vastly different from those of the men, were just as defined by the castle's unwritten rules, its social hierarchy, and its powerful expectations. Their world was one of influence rather than authority, of resilience rather than open rebellion. For a woman born into the nobility, her primary, overarching purpose was singular and strategic: to produce a male heir. In a system built on lineage and inheritance, securing the family name and lands for the next generation was a duty of paramount importance. This duty defined her life from a very young age. Marriages among the nobility were rarely, if ever, romantic arrangements. They were cold, calculated political and economic alliances, brokered between families to consolidate power, acquire land, or seal a peace treaty. A noble girl could be betrothed in childhood to a man she had never met, her future decided in a negotiation where she was a valuable asset, a pawn in the great game of feudal politics. Once married, the lady of the castle, the chatelaine, shouldered an immense weight of responsibility. While her husband was concerned with war and politics, she was the chief administrator of the entire domestic sphere. In her hand, she held the heavy iron keys to the storerooms, the pantry, and the treasury, a tangible symbol of her authority. She managed the vast household staff, oversaw the logistics of food and fuel supplies, kept the accounts, and was responsible for the health and well-being of the entire community. She was expected to be a gracious hostess to important visitors, and crucially, to be capable of running the entire castle, and even commanding its defense during her husband's frequent and often prolonged absences for war or attendance at the royal court. There are remarkable historical accounts of noble women leading the successful defense of their castles against a siege, their courage and strategic skill proving that the weaker sex was often anything but. The center of her world within the castle was the lady's bower or solar. This was the primary female-dominated space, a private chamber set away from the noise and bustle of the great hall. Here, surrounded by her ladies-in-waiting, she would conduct her business, read, or socialize. The quiet murmur of conversation and the rhythmic work of needles on linen would fill the air, a stark contrast to the masculine energy of the bailey and barracks. Yet, even in this sanctuary, the pressures of her role were ever present. The most dangerous time in any woman's life was childbirth. In an age without modern medicine, giving birth was a perilous ordeal with terrifyingly high rates of both maternal and infant mortality. It was a communal experience, attended by the other women of the castle, but it was a battle every woman ultimately faced alone. For the women of the lower classes, the scullery maids, the laundry women, and the servants, life was defined not by strategic marriage, but by relentless, back-breaking labor. They were the invisible engine that kept the castle running. Their work included cooking, cleaning, and spinning thread, but also some of the most physically demanding chores. Laundry was a monumental task. Clothes were boiled in huge cauldrons with lye, a caustic substance made from wood ash, which gave off a strong, unpleasant smell. The wet, heavy garments were then carried to a nearby river or stream and beaten clean against the rocks with heavy wooden paddles. The rhythmic, percussive thump of the paddles was a sound of pure female toil. Many women were also brewers. The term brewster was the original feminine form of brewer, a testament to how integral women were to the production of ale, the staple drink of the castle. While these women had more personal freedom in choosing a partner than their noble counterparts, Their lives were a cycle of hard labor from dawn until dusk. Legally, all women were subordinate to men. A woman's property often became her husband's upon marriage, and her legal identity was subsumed by his. Yet, within this restrictive framework, women wielded significant informal power. A respected chatelain's influence over her husband and her household could be immense. For some women, there was an alternative path to marriage. Joining a convent offered an escape from the demands of family. And childbirth, and paradoxically, could provide opportunities for education, administration, and leadership that were unavailable in the secular world. But for all women, noble or commoner, their honor and reputation were their most precious possessions. In a society so focused on lineage, an accusation of adultery against a noble woman was a catastrophe, capable of destroying alliances, disinheriting children, and bringing utter ruin upon her and her family. Regardless of gender, station, or daily task, every single inhabitant of the castle shared one common, overriding reality. The fortress they lived in was not built for comfort, for justice, or for pageantry. It was built for one reason: defense. The threat of violence, from both within and without, was a constant undercurrent to daily life, an unspoken tension woven into the very fabric of their society. Even in times of prolonged peace, a castle was an armed camp. It was a projection of military power, and its garrison was a permanent fixture. Men at arms, clad in leather jacks or padded gambesons, were a constant presence in the bailey and on the walls. Knights, the elite armored cavalry of the age, along with their squires, were the core of the lord's military might. Weapons were not locked away until they were needed. They were an omnipresent feature of the environment. The dagger was a common personal accessory, carried by men of all classes, from the noble to the servant, used as a tool for eating and, if necessary, for self-defense. The sight of swords at the hip was normal. Practice and training were a relentless daily routine. The castle's bailey was a de facto training ground. You would hear the percussive thud of swords striking the pell, a thick wooden post used for practicing cuts and thrusts. Another common training aid was the quinton, a rotating target on a post, often with a shield on one side and a weighted bag on the other. A knight would charge it with a lance. If he struck the shield correctly, it would spin harmlessly. If he was slow or inaccurate, the rotating arm would swing around and smack him with the bag, a comical and painful lesson in speed. At the archery butts, targets made of turf or straw, you would hear the constant whiz and thud of arrows as men practiced their marksmanship. This constant focus on martial skill, combined with the close quarters and masculine environment, meant that casual violence was common. Brawls among soldiers, often fueled by ale and sparked by a disputed dice game or a perceived insult to one's honor, were a frequent occurrence. The tension in the air during a dispute between armed men could be thick and dangerous, a reminder of how quickly life could be extinguished. The Lord's justice might punish such transgressions, but it could not eliminate the underlying volatility. The heart of the castle's military readiness was the armory. This was a secure, often windowless room, smelling sharply of steel, oil, and leather. Here, weapons were stored in neat racks: swords, spears, bills, and halberds. Crossbows, powerful and slow to load, were kept ready. Suits of armor stood like silent, empty sentinels. Maintaining this equipment was a crucial and unending task for the castle squires and armorers. They spent their days painstakingly cleaning rust from chainmail, sharpening blades on a whetstone, and repairing the leather straps and buckles of the armor. The fear of a siege was the ultimate nightmare, and preparations for it were always a concern. Food stores were meticulously managed and inventoried. The castle's water supply, the well in the bailey, was its most critical asset and would be fiercely protected from poison or capture. The gatehouse was the nerve center of the defense. It was a fortress within a fortress, often featuring multiple iron portcullises that could be dropped to trap attackers' narrow slits for archers and murder holes in the ceiling through which defenders could drop rocks, boiling water, or quicklime onto the enemy below. The guards at the gatehouse were the castle's most trusted and heavily armed soldiers. But threats did not only come from the outside. Internal security was also a major concern. A spy could gather information on the castle's defenses. A traitor could open a gate at night. An assassin could strike at the Lord himself. To counter this, the Lord kept a personal bodyguard of trusted knights, a visible symbol of his power and a deterrent against any who might wish him harm. Even the grand tournaments, for all their pageantry and sport, served the grim purpose of hardening knights for the reality of combat, keeping their skills sharp and their bodies accustomed to the violence of their trade. The castle was a society built on the threat of the sword. It was a place of safety, a bastion against a dangerous world, but it achieved that safety through the constant readiness for and practice of violence. The castle was a society built on strength, from the stones of its walls to the arms of its soldiers. As evening approaches, think about the complex web of relationships and rules we've seen. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments as the castle prepares to lock its gates against the coming night. The sun, which governed the hours of labor, has finally relinquished its hold on the sky. The air grows cooler, and long, deep shadows stretch from the towers, creeping across the bailey like a slow tide. The day's work is done. A different mood settles over the castle, a communal sense of winding down. As the world outside grows dim, the great hall, which served as a courtroom and a workshop, now comes into its own as the hearth of the community, drawing everyone together for the second and final meal of the day, supper. This evening meal, served towards dusk, was a far simpler and lighter affair than the grand dinner served at midday. The frantic energy of the kitchens has subsided. The great roasts are gone. Instead, the fare is humble, designed to comfort and satisfy rather than to impress. Often, it consisted of the leftovers from dinner, repurposed and served again. For many, it was a simple meal of bread, a hunk of hard cheese, and perhaps a baked apple, all washed down with the ever-present ale, or for those at the high table, a cup of wine. While the nobility may have picked at their midday meal, for many of the servants and laborers, supper was their most substantial meal. It was the first chance they had after a day of relentless business to sit, rest their weary bodies, and eat without the pressure of their next chore looming over them. As the trestle tables are once again set up in the main body of the hall, the rigid social geography of the castle is laid bare for all to see. The lord, his lady, their children, and any honored guests take their seats at the high table. This table stands apart, often positioned on a raised wooden dais, physically elevating them above everyone else. It is from this vantage point that the Lord can survey his entire household. Below them, stretching down the length of the hall, are the long, rough-hewn trestle tables for the lower ranks. A knight, a steward, or a chaplain might sit near the top of these tables. Above the salt, a large and often ornate salt cellar that acted as a social dividing line. The further ones sat from the high table, the lower their status. The men-at-arms, the household servants, the grooms, and the kitchen hands all knew their place, an unspoken understanding that governed every aspect of their lives. As true darkness gathers outside, the battle for light begins within. The primary source of illumination and warmth is the great central hearth, its massive fire casting a warm, dancing glow on the faces of those seated nearby. Its light, however, cannot reach the far corners of the cavernous hall, which remain lost in deep, impenetrable shadow. This is where artificial lighting becomes crucial, and once again, it is a marker of wealth and status. At the high table, tall candles of pure beeswax are lit. Beeswax was a precious commodity, expensive and controlled largely by the church. It burned with a bright, steady, and clean flame, producing very little smoke and giving off a faint, pleasant, honey-like scent. For the rest of the hall, the light is of a far meaner quality. Their tables are lit by tallow candles. These were made from rendered animal fat, usually from sheep or cattle. They were cheap to produce, but they were a foul substitute for beeswax. Tallow candles sputtered and smoked, casting a greasy black soot into the air that irritated the eyes and coated the rafters. They burned with a dimmer, more yellow light, and gave off a constant, unpleasant smell of hot animal grease. Even cheaper and more common were rushlights. A rushlight was a primitive and ephemeral taper made by harvesting the common rush plant, peeling back its outer layer to reveal the absorbent inner pith, and then soaking that pith in leftover kitchen fat. When lit, it would provide a feeble, flickering light for perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, giving off a steady stream of acrid smoke. The air in the great hall at supper time was therefore a thick, atmospheric blend of wood smoke, roasting meat, unwashed bodies, and the distinct, cloying smell of burning fat. The sounds of the hall are a warm, communal symphony. The low murmur of dozens of conversations, the clatter of wooden bowls and pewter spoons, the laughter of soldiers sharing a joke, all echoing and blending under the high, smoke-blackened rafters. Dogs, a constant feature of castle life, patrol the floor between the tables. They are a shaggy, restless carpet, weaving between legs, their eyes fixed on the diners, waiting with practiced patience for a scrap of gristle or a gnawed bone to be tossed their way. The taste of the meal is simple. The rough texture of dark bread, the sharp tang of hard cheese, the slightly sour flavor of the small beer or the watered-down wine. The atmosphere can shift. On a quiet night, it is one of weary, communal contentment. But if a visiting minstrel is present, or if the Lord is feeling generous with the ale, the hall can become loud and boisterous, filled with song and laughter that pushes back against the encroaching night. The meal concludes not with dessert, but with a ritual of hygiene for the upper classes. Pages, young boys in service to the Lord, move to the high table carrying basins of water, often scented with rose petals or lavender, and clean linen towels. The Lord and his family wash their hands, a practical necessity after a meal eaten largely with the fingers, but also a formal signal that supper has ended. Soon after, the great trestle tables are cleared. The boards and their supports are dismantled and stacked neatly against the stone walls. This act transforms the space once more, clearing the floor for an evening of entertainment, or, more commonly, preparing the hall for its final function of the day, as a vast, communal dormitory for the castle's humblest inhabitants. As the last plates are cleared, the final songs are sung, and the great hall grows dimmer and quieter, the castle begins a series of sacred nightly rituals. These are not rituals of celebration, but of security. They are practiced every single night, without fail, a solemn and necessary procedure to protect the community from the very real dangers that come with the dark. The open, bustling fortress of the day must now become a sealed, impenetrable stronghold for the night. The process begins with a sound. A deep, resonant bell begins to toll from the chapel or a dedicated bell tower. This is the curfew bell. The word comes from the Old French couvre-feu, which literally means cover fire. This sound carries for miles across the surrounding countryside, a clear signal to any farmer, traveler, or villager that the castle gates are about to close. It is a warning to find shelter for the night, for once the gates are barred, they will not open again until sunrise. The bell's original purpose was also one of fire safety, a command for households to bank their hearths, covering the embers with ash to prevent a stray spark from causing a catastrophic fire in the night. In the close-packed, timber and thatch world of a medieval town or a castle's outbuildings, fire was a terrifying and ever-present threat. All eyes now turned to the gatehouse, the castle's jaw, and its most vulnerable point. The constable of the castle, the man ultimately responsible for its security, or his captain of the guard, oversees the procedure. It is a noisy physical process. First, you hear the groaning creak of the massive winches as a team of guards turn the heavy capstans. Ropes and chains grow taut as they slowly, laboriously raise the heavy wooden drawbridge, lifting it from the far bank of the moat to press it flush against the gatehouse, forming the first barrier. Next come the doors. The main gates are not single doors, but massive, thick oak portals, heavily reinforced with iron bands and studs. With a great, collective heave, the guards swing them shut, their closing marked by a deep boom that echoes across the courtyard. A massive wooden beam, as thick as a man's thigh, is then lifted and slid into heavy iron brackets on either side of the wall, barring the doors securely from the inside. The scraping sound of this huge bar being set in place is a sound of profound finality, but the process is not yet complete. The gatehouse is designed as a death trap. Looking up inside the gatehouse passage, you would see one or more iron portcullises, heavy grills with spiked bottoms, curvedly held aloft in the ceiling. On the command, a lever is pulled, a ratchet is released, and with a thunderous crashing boom that shakes the very stones, the portcullis drops, its spikes embedding themselves in the ground. Anyone caught in the passage between the drawbridge and the now lowered portcullis would be trapped, vulnerable to attack from the archers in the slits above. With the gates physically sealed, a more formal ceremony might take place. The head of the watch, carrying the enormous iron keys to the various locks of the gatehouse, would march to the great hall or the constable's quarters. He would present the keys, a tangible symbol of the castle's security, perhaps with a formal exchange of words, a ritual not unlike the ceremony of the keys still practiced to this day at the Tower of London. The watchword or password for the night would be issued. This secret word would be the only way to identify friend from foe in the darkness. Now the castle changes. The sentries for the night watch take their positions on the battlements, and in the high towers, their numbers increased from the daytime guard. Lit by the flickering light of a torch, their helmets and spear tips glint in the darkness. They begin their slow, methodical patrols, their footsteps a lonely, rhythmic crunch on the stone walkways. The night is divided into shifts, and to ensure no one is sleeping on duty, The guards have a system of calling out to one another across the dark expanse of the castle. From one tower to the next, you would hear the faint, reassuring cry, "All is well." This call, a small human sound in the vast, silent night, was a comfort to the sleeping inhabitants below. Once the gates were barred and the watch was set, the castle was hermetically sealed. No one was permitted to enter or leave until morning, except in the case of the most dire emergency. The feeling of enclosure was absolute. The castle was no longer a home, but a ship battened down against the storm of the night. Locked within the solid embrace of the stone walls, protected by gates, guards, and moats, the inhabitants are now left to face the night itself. For the medieval mind, the darkness was more than just a simple absence of light. It was a different realm, a different state of being. The profound, oppressive blackness of a pre-industrial night was a tyranny, a source of both real and deeply imagined terrors that held sway over the human psyche for the long hours until dawn. In a world lit only by fire and the distant, cold light of the stars, true darkness was an experience we can barely comprehend. When the last candle was extinguished and the fire burned down to embers, the blackness was absolute. You could not see your hand in front of your face. This physical blindness opened the door to psychological fears. The night was believed to be the time when the veil between the world of the living and the world of the supernatural was at its thinnest. It was the domain of ghosts, demons, wandering spirits, and all manner of malevolent beings. Around the last dying embers of the fire, people would tell stories. They were tales of restless spirits haunting the castle corridors, of monstrous beasts lurking in the dark forests beyond the walls, and of demonic temptations that visited in the night. These stories were not just entertainment. They reinforced a collective, cultural fear of the dark. This fear was not confined to the supernatural. The darkness held very real dangers. Even familiar spaces became treacherous. The winding, unlit stone staircases and cavernous, shadowy rooms of the castle were transformed into menacing landscapes of unseen obstacles. A simple trip from a straw pallet in the great hall to the guardrobe in the middle of the night was a perilous journey. You would have to navigate in pitch blackness, one hand trailing along the cold, rough stone wall, relying solely on memory to avoid a misstep that could send you tumbling down a flight of stairs. The sounds of the night, so easily ignored during the day, were amplified by the darkness and the heightened sense of hearing. The howl of the wind whistling through the crenellations on the battlements sounded like a mournful cry. The hoot of a distant owl could be a terrifying omen. The constant, unseen scurrying of rats in the walls became the scratching of something altogether more sinister. An unexpected touch in the dark from another sleeping person could jolt the heart with a primal fear. Crime, too, flourished under the cover of darkness. An enemy who had managed to hide within the walls, or a traitorous servant with a grudge, was at their most dangerous in the dead of night. An assassin's knife was deadliest in a black, sleeping chamber. Nightmares were not just bad dreams. They were often interpreted as literal demonic visitations, assaults on the soul by the forces of evil, or prophetic omens of disaster to come. To ward off these terrors, a wealthy lord might have a nightlight, often a single, precious candle left to burn in a basin of water to prevent it from tipping over and starting a fire. But for most, sleep came in total darkness. The very pattern of sleep was different. It was not always a single, unbroken block of 8 hours. Historians speak of segmented sleep being common in the pre-industrial world. An individual might go to sleep at dusk and sleep for 3 or 4 hours, then wake up for a period of an hour or two around midnight. This period of wakefulness, known as the watch, was not seen as insomnia, but as a normal part of the night. It was a quiet, contemplative time used for prayer, for intimate conversation with a spouse or bedfellow, for tending to a sick child, or for simply reflecting on the day. After this interval, they would go back to sleep for a second sleep that would last until dawn. The only relief from this oppressive blackness came from the heavens. On a clear night, the moon and stars provided the only natural light. A bright, full moon could bathe the castle courtyard in a soft, silvery, ethereal glow, transforming the familiar stone into something magical and making the sentry's job much easier. But a cloudy, moonless night brought a darkness so profound it felt like a physical weight, a suffocating blanket that swallowed all light and all hope, leaving the castle's inhabitants to the mercy of their fears and the long, slow wait for the sun. Getting lost within the castle, its own sprawling and complex layout, was a very real and frightening possibility for a guest or a new servant caught in this absolute dark. Against this backdrop of profound darkness and deep-seated fear, the inhabitants of the castle, from the lord and his solar to the lowest servant on the floor, finally seek the brief, blessed refuge of sleep. The long, hard day is over, and the body and mind crave a surrender, an escape into unconsciousness that will, with luck, last until the first hint of dawn. The final preparations for bed are like everything else, a reflection of one's place in the castle's world. For the lord and lady, retiring is a ritual. In their private solar, warmed by the embers of their own fireplace, their servants attend to them. The lady is helped out of her heavy gown, her laces untied. The lord is relieved of his tunic and belt. Their complex outer clothing, layered for warmth and status, is carefully folded and put away. They would typically sleep not in the nude, but in their simple linen undergarments, a chemise for the lady and an undertunic for the lord. A final comfort might be offered, a small cup of wine, often heated and spiced with cinnamon or cloves, a gentle nightcap intended to calm the mind and aid sleep. Their bed is the most important piece of furniture they own, often the first and most valuable item listed in a lord's will. It is a huge 4-poster construction of carved oak. Its most vital feature is the set of thick, heavy curtains that surround it on all sides. Before they get in, a servant might use a bed warmer. This was a long-handled pan made of copper or brass with a hinged lid. It would be filled with hot coals from the fireplace and then passed quickly and carefully between the icy linen sheets, chasing away the bone-deep chill and dampness. Once the bed is warmed, the lord and lady climb in, and the curtains are drawn tight. This creates a small, dark, private tent, a chamber within a chamber that traps their body heat and protects them from the cold drafts that snake across the stone floor. For the servants and soldiers, there is no such ceremony. There are no servants to help them undress, no spiced wine, no bed warmers. Their preparation is simple and swift. They find a space on the rush-covered floor of the great hall, or in their crowded barracks. For warmth, they often sleep in the same clothes they wore all day, perhaps removing only their boots. They possess no bed, only a lumpy straw palliasse, if they are fortunate. For most, it is just the hard floor. They pull a single, rough, scratchy wool blanket over themselves, huddling together for shared body warmth. Their last sight is the faint orange glow of the dying embers in the central hearth, the last vestige of warmth and light in the vast, dark space. Before closing their eyes, prayers are said. A simple pater noster or an appeal to a patron saint. A quiet request whispered into the darkness for protection through the long, perilous night. And then they try to sleep. But the castle is never truly silent. Sleep is not a descent into quiet oblivion, but a fitful state, constantly disturbed by the sounds of the community. The hall is filled with the chorus of dozens of sleeping people. Deep snores, wet coughs, the occasional cry of a baby, the whimper of a dog dreaming by the fire. And from outside, the faint, periodic call of the sentry on the wall, a reminder that even in sleep, the castle is under guard. For a guest, sleeping arrangements were a clear and immediate indicator of their status. An important visitor would be granted a private chamber, perhaps even with its own fireplace. A lesser guest might find themselves having to share a bed with another person, a common practice at the time. The universal desire for sleep was a battle against the physical discomfort of the cold floor, the lumpy, pest-infested straw, and the unyielding hardness of stone. Too, it was a battle against the noises of a communal dormitory and the anxieties of the dark. For everyone within these walls, sleep was not a luxury. It was a necessary surrender, a brief and precious escape from the toil and hardship that they knew, with absolute certainty, would begin again with the first cruel light of dawn. And so, our long day in the medieval castle comes to an end. From the cold awakening to the final closing of the eyes, it was a life of constant challenge. A world away from our own, yet filled with the same human need for warmth, for food, for safety, and for the simple peace of a night's rest. As the sentries keep their watch on the cold stone walls, we leave the castle's inhabitants to their slumber. Now, it is time for you, too, to find your own rest. If our journey has helped you unwind, we hope you'll join us again. Until then, sleep well.